Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this webinar hosted by the Center for Islamic Research, CIRA. My name is Maulana Abdulrazak Ukwayo, and I have the pleasure of chairing this session this evening. Tonight's discussion, Sudan Tracing the Origins of Crisis, comes at a deeply critical moment. And April 26 marks 3 years since the outbreak of the current conflict in Sudan. But as we know, this crisis did not begin in 2023. It is rooted in much longer historical trajectories of conflict, governance, challenges, and uneven development. As highlighted in recent report by the Institute of Security Studies and UNDP, Sudan today stands at a critical juncture. Despite its immense natural resources, strategic location, and youthful population, the country has remained trapped in cycles of conflict, institutional fragility, and economic underperformance. Now, since the start of the war in 2023, and remember, Sudan's war never just started in 2023, but the way we say it is long. But since the start of this current war in 2023, the consequences have been devastating. Millions have been displaced. Nearly half the population is facing acute food insecurity, and millions more have been pushed into extreme poverty. Now, the report also marks a very clear point. The violent conflict is the single most significant constraint on Sudan's development. I therefore have the great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Shamil Jeppie. Professor, you are welcome. Professor Shamil is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Cape Town. He studied in Cape Town, Princeton, and was postdoctoral fellow of Oxford University. During his PhD at Princeton, he worked on the Sudan, an area of research and continues to be of interest to him. He first traveled to Sudan in 1995. And 1995, 2 years just before I went to Sudan, I got the opportunity of being in Sudan for over 10 years from 1998. So he first traveled to Sudan in 1995 and visited the country numerous times since then. How, Professor, you must have visited Sudan while I was there, but unlikely we couldn't just meet. Professor has also worked in West Africa and on Mali in particular. His new book is Writing Timbuktu, the book in West African History, Princeton University Press of 2026. Professor, welcome again this evening to address all those that are attending. And I would like just to inform some housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones muted. I know we muted them, but something might happen that yours comes on. Please keep it muted. You are welcome to post questions in the chat. They will be dealt with later on. And we'll have almost 20 minutes after the session of Prof for question and answer. So post all the questions that you have and all your concerns on the chat. Professor, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maulana. And you know, I don't know, maybe we did cross paths in somewhere in Khartoum or Durman. And I really enjoyed traveling in the Sudan, and wonderful people that you can also talk about. But let me get started. So for those of you who are used to PowerPoints, I don't really do PowerPoint, even in my lectures at UCT. I say get real and get used to the blackboard and take notes and do it the good old-fashioned way. So let me get started by saying we tend to look at events in very short-term perspective, and I think it's necessary, and thank you very much to the organizers, to Ismail Wadi and Zakira and Maulana and others for inviting me, because I'm by training an historian of the Sudan and Sudanic Africa. So I've been moving across the Sudanic area, which is much more than Sudan, and that whole Sahelian area. So the name Sudan comes from the Arabic Bilad Sudan, which was the land of the blacks, which the Arabic writers used to describe this world beyond what they knew. And it wasn't a racial description. We won't go into other terms that were used for Africa, but the modern Republic of Sudan is indeed a very modern idea. It is a creation by the British, and it is, like so many other territories of the continent, was put together after British conquest in 1899. And in fact, in 1899, Darfur was not yet part of that conquest. I'll say more about Darfur, of course, but Darfur only gets incorporated into what becomes known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan from around 1916 onwards. But I'm getting ahead of myself now. So Sudan, what we know of, which is I'm going to stick to now, is really the Nile Valley. We have to think of the Nile Valley going from the sources in Uganda through what is today southern Sudan, up through what is today just the Republic of Sudan into Egypt, and then of course the Blue Nile coming from Lake Tana. That is really the key geographical phenomenon that one needs to know and take note of in understanding this history. It's the Nile, and we'll come back to looking at the Nile. But Darfur is very far from the Nile, and the modern history of Sudan really begins with the conquest by the Egyptians, which is really should be used in inverted commas, because that conquest, which happened in 1820, was actually done by the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turkish rulers of Egypt. The ruler of Egypt at the time was a man called Mehmed Ali, who comes from the area around Albania today. You know Arabic, and in fact, Arabic was not the language of the Egyptian political elite until the 1860s. Administrative history of Egypt, you need to know Ottoman Turkish, and Arabic is only introduced in the 1860s as the administrative language. So the conquest of what we know as of the Sudan now, from the area around Dungula downwards, was done in an Ottoman-esque fashion, Ottoman sort of conquering fashion, the late Ottoman period. And all the nomenclature, which was Ottoman Turkish. And the Sudanese thus call that period the Turkiya. This is the period of the Turkiya. The period in Egyptian history from 1820 until the 1880s, 1890 is called the Turkiya, and it's called the oppression of the Turkiya, the this of the Turkiya, that. It's because they refer to them as the Turks. So that's important phenomenon to remember. The conquest was brutal, was absolutely brutal. And the purpose of the Ottoman Egyptians in the Sudan was pillage. There was very little logic to it. They had the imagination that there was gold, which at the time little was discovered. They employed lots of Europeans as they were modernizing, improving, reforming, whatever. They employed Austrian mining engineers, etc., who went to the borderlands with Ethiopia and spoke about gold being found there, etc. Now we know there is gold, but at the time, not much was found. And so they basically pillaged the country, contributed very little to the development of the country, until in the 1880s, a resistance movement emerged by a man called Muhammad Ahmad. And Muhammad Ahmad declared himself to be the Mahdi. And this is the beginning of the Mahdist movement in the Sudan. He dies in 1885, and he is succeeded by a man called his Khalifa Abdullahi, who really turns this movement into a state. It's quite a sophisticated state with a currency, with a chancery, etc., etc., and it puts the Turkey under great stress. And that is when the Turkey, the Ottoman Egyptians, who have now sort of Arabized, become more localized, invite the British in. And this is when the figure, the well-known British imperialist figure, Charles Gordon, enters the Sudan. Firstly in 1870s, and then later on as governor. And of course, he is killed at Khartoum in the Battle of Khartoum. And there's this famous image of him standing very proudly. He is sort of the icon of late 19th century British imperialism. He had served in China. He had been all over the place. He was also quite messianic. And so you had almost like two messianic movements, the Mahdists and the British figure of Charles Gordon. In any case, the Mahdist movement, fearing further success, the British marched in 1898 under Kitchener. Now, we will know Kitchener because Kitchener comes to South Africa to fight for the British, to lead the British in the South African War, or the so-called Anglo-Boer War. But he first exercises his violence in the Sudan. And it is very violent. They beat the Mahdists in a very, very short period because they come with modern machine guns, Maxim gun, and so on. They mow down the tens of thousands of the Mahdists as they march from into the Sudan. And the final battle is the battle at Durman. And in fact, the body of the Mahdi is disinterred, and it is cut up, and whatever remains, or his remains, are strewn across into the Nile so that nobody can make a sort of a place of worship or gathering point of mobilization against the new occupiers. And 1899 then is the beginning of what becomes known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. It is the only time and place I know of that where two powers jointly control one colonial space. The Anglo-Egyptian condominium is what Sudan is called from 1899 until independence in 1956. Now, it's basically the British Sudan because they are the governors, they are the senior people, and the sort of middle management are the Egyptians, who are now no longer the Turks, but they are Arabic-speaking Egyptians. One thing one must remember about the Turkish, the Ottoman impact on Egyptian Arabic, for instance, it is, from my knowledge of all the Arabic dialects I've encountered, it is the most inflected with Turkish words. If anybody knows Egyptian Arabic, you will know the countless Ottoman and Turkish, modern Turkish words in Egyptian Arabic. And in the Sudan, Sudan has its own Arabic dialects, but that Egyptian strain is there, because many Egyptians are part of the administration in this Anglo-Egyptian condominium in the Sudan. They establish, eventually later on, they have a branch of Al-Azhar, they have a branch of Cairo University, and lots of Egyptians go and work as sort of middle-level people in the education system, etc., etc. But the British run the space. And what is unique, or what is a sort of a model case of colonialism, of British colonialism in Sudan, is their use of indirect rule. At any one point in the Sudan, there were only about 800 or so senior people running the country. That includes Darfur, which is only conquered in 1916. It's phenomenal given the size of the place. Until the cutting up of the country into two, Sudan was Africa's largest country. And to imagine this country being run by so few men, and they're all men, is quite remarkable. How do they do it? Is through indirect rule, through employing chiefs or the local sheikhs. And they, in fact, and we'll come back to talk a lot about Sharia. They, in fact, use Sharia, as I called it in an article, colonial Sharia. It's colonial Sharia. It is Sharia as long as it conforms to British standards. But it's enacted, and they in the south of the country, which is not Islamic, which we'll come to again. They employ sort of so-called tribal law, and where there are societies that don't have chiefs, and they try to invent chiefs and structures. So there are well-known groups there that are stateless, that are leaderless, that are very low level, no hierarchies. They don't know what to do with these people, such as the Nuer, and they have to find structures to control them. But they then. So indirect rule is a feature of British colonialism in Africa, and it is particularly pronounced in the Sudan. And from there, of course, they share it with Nigeria and other parts, Uganda, etc., etc. A good number of the British officials in the Sudan actually come from India. So India is an important linkage. Bombay and officials had the experience with the warrior tribes in India, and India is extremely important for us to understand African history and that whole area in the Horn, the impact. So the British, in 1944, 48 thereabouts, some senior British official is asked about potential self-government or responsible government for Sudan. And the British official replies, we'll start thinking about it in 20 years' time. That would be in the 60s, in the late 60s. Well, Sudan gets independence in 56. Why? It's not because it has a fantastically organized and mass-based nationalist movement. Why does it get independence in 56? Because of what happened in Egypt. It's the rise of Nasser. Now, there was a strand of Sudanese nationalism that argued for the unity of the Nile Valley, that Sudan is actually part of the brotherly Egyptian neighbor. And if that strand had been successful, the British should have dealt with a huge problem, and the West should have dealt with a huge problem if you had such a mega state, especially with the turn of events in Egypt under Nasser, and who was not a socialist at all, but Nasser set around, of course, nationalizing the Suez Canal, and this was just anathema to Western and British interests. And so when Nasser, the Nasserist coup d'etat or revolution, as they call it, happened in 52, the monarchy was sent packing. Soon thereafter, the British in Sudan started plotting or organizing or mobilizing for Sudanese independence. And they did this only with the northerners, with the Arabic-speaking northerners. The whole of the south of Sudan, the line that divided the so-called Arabic-speaking Muslim north from the non-Muslim south, was very underdeveloped. The British invested very little. They allowed 6 missionary organizations to run the administration in the south of Sudan. And at independence, the whole of south of Sudan, which is a huge territory, had only 1 high school, and nobody was present. Nobody had a substantial or substantive influence from the south in the peace negotiations or in the negotiations for independence. And thus, the Sudanese army that the British had developed, which had some southerners, they rebelled, and the first civil war starts immediately on independence. The southerners rebelled against this deal. So then already the story begins. And so the main fault line in Sudanese history before the question of Darfur is this north-south split, the north-south struggle, the southerners feeling marginalized, isolated, discriminated against, etc., and the northerners having rather prejudiced views against these southerners who have none of the hierarchies and structures and culture that the northerners have, etc., etc. Now, what do I mean by the north? Actually, that elite is a small northern elite from tribes or so-called tribes that live in the area around Shendi. Maulana will know Shendi probably, Dongula, around those northern reaches of the Nile. And these are tribes who are the Ja'aliyin, etc. There are 4 or 5 of these groups. This is historically the power center of Arabic-speaking Sudan. These families, and they usually say there are about 40 of these families that have run the show. So when we're talking about the Arabs of Sudan, you're basically referring to these groupings in the far north that had a sort of diaspora, a trading diaspora down south and further throughout the country. And it is also the basis of the prejudice and their campaigns and their power in the Darfur, because all the governors of Darfur as a state within the larger Sudanese state came from that area. The Darfurians by the 70s, 80s, notice this pattern that we are never getting positions of authority. You're sending people from these areas. We are Muslim, you are Muslim. We are not Arab. But does that mean we can't rule ourselves or be the sort of regional governors? You have to send people from the northern Sudan. The northern Sudanese were we must understand this in the context of the Cold War and the rise of pan-Arabism and Arabist ideology. And so they took on that identity that we are Arab, which is a totally constructed identity. I always joke with my Sudanese friends or students, you're actually Arabic-speaking Africans. That's what it is. You can have a love for the Arabic language, for love of Arabic culture, but you are Africans. And this is kind of jarring. But the moment at which they adopted this ideology of we are Arabs, it's the moment when there's a larger Arabic-speaking world which they are sharing part of. Remember that Cairo connection is important for their self-identity. And it's important as a reaction against the British who promoted English and who promoted Christianity, especially in the South. The Sudan, as a former British colony, does not join the Commonwealth on independence. That is a sign, and it tends towards the Arabic-speaking world, and it promotes the idea that we are Arabs. The fact is, in those same parts of the northern Sudan, there are Nubians, for instance. There are many other groups of people speaking all sorts of dialects of Arabic and other languages. Now, the civil war is a defining feature of Sudanese history up till the question of Darfur, and they eventually go for independence and get their independence. There's firstly a transitional period between 2005 and 2011, and South Africa, our government was very influential and very present and did lots of training of future diplomats, etc., future bureaucrats. Now, that is the struggle that defines the Sudan. And ultimately, of course, the South gets independence. But at its beginning and for a long time, under the iconic leader of the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, the Southern People's Movement, they never initially asked for independence. They wanted, at best, autonomy, but equal citizenship. And they wanted, when Sharia began to be the discourse, the ruling discourse under Numeiri from 83 onwards, they said, this doesn't apply to us. We don't want to be subjected to this. And of course, that Sharia discourse remains strong and becomes the discourse that is behind the rise of Bashir in 89. And the Sharia-minded people, the National Islamic Front of Hassan Torabi, etc., who had never official position. He was always behind. His highest position was Attorney General, and they promoted the idea that Sharia will be the solution. And the fact is, Sharia was already being implemented. The British had recognized Sharia. And what they meant by it when Numeiri came to power in 83 was basically harsh Islamic punishments. And they could have, otherwise it was quite empty. There was nothing. It was basically punitive Sharia, not productive. And the economy, they continue to rely on outside remittances and outsiders to support them and so on. They had no real program to transform the country. So the Southerners obviously wanted autonomy and didn't a federal structure. That was the most they went to. But with the referendum of 2005, they went for independence, that transition period, and they went for independence in 2011. Now, the question of Southern Sudan is another issue. It is a tragedy. It was born a corrupt, failed state. And it's unfortunate that what is happening, we could see something akin to Darfur if you watch Southern Sudan carefully, and the internecine fighting between the president and the vice president. And it's very much out of the news because there's so much terrible stuff happening elsewhere. But keep your eyes on Southern Sudan. Now, we know the Darfur people have been militating and been organizing and been talking about discrimination from the center. And they published a book called The Black Book, sort of done desktop publishing, home sort of copied and produced thousands of these and distributed in the mosques in the early 2000s. That basically was a kind of documentation of discrimination by the center, by the government, by the Bashir government. And the four people, as I said, they're not obviously they speak the four language, but they Muslim, the whole area is predominantly. But there are other groups around the edges and down in the Nuba Mountains and in Kordofan and so on. Basically, the center, the Khartoum, was trying to spread the civilizing ideology that Torabi had articulated. So there was an ideological component. The other component is also an ecological component, where you have the pastoralists in conditions of climate change and less and less pasturage encroaching on the agriculturalists. And what is happened, how this is cast, it is cast as Arabs against Africans, or the Africans being the agriculturalists settled and the pastoralists being the Arabs. That's a simplification of the issue. The larger context, if I can just wrap up, the larger context is the region. So is the whole of north of the Horn of Africa that we need to take into consideration, and we need to follow it, because you see this kind of thing happening in Ethiopia also, regions reacting to the center, which is dominated by the Amhara, and this is going to come into the news a lot. What is necessary to know in terms of the regions is that Ethiopia supports the RSF, even if it's not explicitly, because historically Sudan and Ethiopia have been supporting rival liberation movements. The Ethiopians always supported the Southern Sudanese, and the Sudanese supported the Eritreans. And this is a sort of ongoing game that they've been playing, and human lives are at issue here. So we can move a camera either on the larger perspective, or a larger panoptic view of the region, which is necessary because there's Somalia also, and Somaliland, the breakaway Somaliland, also complicit in supporting the RSF. And you may know, of course, that the RSF basically comes out of the militias that had been cultivated by Bashir, called the Janjaweed. That was the first installation of the genocide against the four people. So I don't know, I mean, I can go on, but that's a kind of brief, broad stroke outline, and you can ask me any questions that I'll try to answer, or Maulana will try to answer, since he lived in Sudan as well. Thank you. Yeah, what is the origins of the current crisis? What is most commonly misunderstood? I do think that there is, we don't understand the situation, Darfur, as a polity. As I said, this is my bias as an historian. Darfur got incorporated into the colonial state very late, the latest of all the other areas. So Darfur had a long history, independent history, and of actually a very sophisticated state based in Fasher. And we know relatively more about the structure of authority in pre-colonial Fasher and the fourth state, because there's some written sources, but it's in a sense closer culturally, if I may say so, to Chad and to the areas to its west than to the areas to its east. You know, very few people work on Darfur. I have a few colleagues, a late Dutch colleague who did an 800-page book on the women in a small village of close to Fasher, and some other colleagues who worked on the Tijaniya in the Sufi order in Four. But you can count on your one hand the number of people who have done work, really deep scholarly work on Four. A late senior colleague of mine was an Anglo-Irishman called Rex O'Fahy, who did the most extensive work in the English-speaking world, or in the European setting, apart from Sudanese people. But Ofai's work is fundamental to understanding Darfur. I think the one absence is understanding very closely ecological crises. I haven't gone into repeated climate and crises and famines which hit that area. We know of the famines in Ethiopia, but in the 80s, there were also the famines in Sudan, which had a devastating impact. So this climate change we need to bring into this. And depending on what source standards, it's very uneven. Okay, I think that the whole history is total history. Maybe, but from my reading of the primary materials for the Turkiya and so on, it was extraordinary. It was most extraordinary because it had very little relation to sort of mobilizing labor to come to the mines or to do some. It was quite egregious and gratuitous. And I've been trying to make sense of why it was so violent. What purpose do you have in yeah. I think there's another question, a good question here. I have great problem with this term. And the fact is, in South Africa, we're very sensitive to it. South African scholars, we as a whole are very careful because of these by the British and the fixed nature and the purposes with which they did do it. But if you go to those, people know in the recent book I did, I have a chapter on Mauritania. Tribe, and I didn't know what to do. I have so-called, I have inverted commas, but the fact is all the documentation generated by the people there talk of Kabila and Qabila, Qabail, tribes and tribes. So it's something which requires to go back again to this critical literature that emerged on Africa since the 60s that have historicized tribe, and we try not to use it. But you know what? My students tell me openly what tribe they belong to. They say, this is my tribe. So I don't know if I'm answering that questions. Let me see. Yeah.
Prof Ismail, yeah. Just a question from my side. What about the role of, say, countries like the UAE, the Saudis, the sort of wider, beyond just the Horn of Africa, Egypt, in the current dynamics or the most recent dynamics in Sudan?
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good question, because we've seen the UAE and, in fact, Sudan, whatever remains of the central state, took the UAE and attempted to make a case against them for genocide, because they are known to support the RSF. And generally, the UAE has played a very reactionary role, as we would say, to stir up sectarian and secessionist politics in the whole Horn. They, from Yemen onwards, of course, the Saudis and the UAE have been involved in Yemen, and of course now they fell out because the Saudis said just know your limits in Yemen to the UAE, but their support for Somaliland, secessionist breakaway territory in the north of Somalia, and they trying to foster this in Libya, and Libya has a small border with small, slight, but it has been an avenue through for Sudanese refugees and others trying to get out of the region via Libya, but they support Haftar. So somebody put it very well, we're living through a period of secessionism and the promotion of secessionism, which is a big danger for the continent, big danger. I mean, I'm in Cape Town and we have a Cape Town Independence Party here. We don't take it seriously now, but it will become serious at some point. Secessionism is very much the modus operandi of a certain sort of body of political interests, of which the UAE and Israel are very much the leading cheerleaders and actors behind the scenes for. Yeah, none of this could be possible without the flow of arms. I mean, the RSF, which now controls quite a substantial part of the western regions, but still they are landlocked, and the arms have to come through. Various countries, Somalia, Ethiopia, then Sudan, and into the western regions. The Egyptians are firmly on the side of the authorities, the Sudanese army forces. Now, let me just say, both the RSF and the standing army, they were all once part of the Bashir apparatus, okay? And when Bashir fell 2019, through a sort of belated Arab spring uprising by young people, this lasted until 2023 when the military stepped in again. Now, the military is another long-term feature of Sudanese politics. And one of the best scholars of the Sudanese military is, in fact, a South African. It was Ruth First, who wrote a very, very detailed piece on the Sudanese military. That was in the 70s, but an historical overview. And I highly recommend it if you want to understand that. The military is a huge factor, and it's going to be a huge factor, and that needs to be understood.
Okay, I see there's another question in the chat, if you can just get to that. Yeah. And then if I may pose one more question, I mean, while you're considering that, what's the role of the African Union?
Okay, this is a question about hegemonic domination or the deliberate fragmentation suppressing unity in the logical element, where the other Muslim countries were the pawns. Yes, I mean, that's a general point, I suppose, and doesn't apply only to the Sudan. But fragmentation benefits some. And there are always local elements who are to be bought and can be used to unfold and to implement that. Yeah. Okay. What is the question?
Yeah, just one more from my side. I mean, what's the role of the African Union in this whole process?
Yeah. So the African Union. Yeah, the African Union did have, in the first crisis in around 2005. The African Union did have a stabilization force and peacekeepers. And one of my colleagues was a peacekeeper in Darfur. And I had good conversations with him. It was very depressing, he said, very, very depressing. So it was the African Union and the UN, and South Africa had peacekeepers there. There's nothing now, nothing that I know of that's of any effect on the ground. The RSF is quite a formidable force. And that is what is interesting, where they're getting this they obviously also recruiting, no shortage of unemployed young people who can move in and out their ranks opportunistically, because there's no ideology. We don't know. There's no ideology. So yes, there's no peacekeepers that I can recall there was in the first crisis of first genocide. I mean, it's just persisting, of around 2005.
Okay, are there any other questions, Zakir? I'm not able to see the chat from my side, but while we're waiting, are there any mediation efforts at the moment? What's the prospect for peace? I mean, they can't fight endlessly. Either one side wins, or there's a stalemate, and you got to find a negotiated settlement of some sort, and create some stability. So what's the sort of future short-term scenario or medium-term scenario now?
Yeah, look, the question, the key political space in Sudan is Khartoum. It's now larger. It's called Khartoum and the three cities. It's three cities. It's North Khartoum, Khartoum, Durman. The one who controls power. So there are not many other sites. There's Port Sudan, but further north, there's an old town called Shendi, which is where the railway began. And but otherwise, that's the key urban concentration where there is power. And that's now in the hands of the military. And I believe recently flights were coming back into the airport because it was falling out of the hands of the military. I mean, in this case, there are very few good guys, but the military at least are amenable to negotiating and have some kind of legitimacy. But so firstly, who has the key the main sort of urban space where there's the population concentration, some wealth, etc., etc. Again, the logic of the RSF is not clear. What do they want? What do they want? Now, they want power sharing, which nobody once will allow. They won't allow. And on and off, there is a quad, the so-called quad, which is Egypt and Saudi Arabia and a few other, two other countries that are supposed to be conducting the mediation. But of course, the theater of conflict has moved elsewhere. So Sudan is once again forgotten. So the quad is supposed to be.
Okay, I see there's two questions on the chat. One is about the questions of race. They talk about light skin versus dark skin Sudanese in the north. And the second question, as you might be able to see there, is what will be the impact of US sanctions imposed on the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan? Will this further fragment the factions? And then there's, I think a related question is, should we understand the genesis of this conflict from a racial, religious, or tribal perspective, or is it all intertwined?
Oh God, yeah, these are tough questions. Yeah, look, the question, yeah, they're all really questions for if there are any PhD people looking for PhD topics, then go for these questions, go for these, try to address it. It's the literature is very sparse, but the race would be an interesting issue to look into. Color, race, and especially from the British moment. Before the British moment, because these identities become political identities under the British. The fluidity that existed before the British come to. So what the British do, for instance, is they disallow people wearing Islamic wear, the thobe. and the headgear. And the Sudanese headgear is very distinctive. It's a huge body of fabric on your head, but they make that illegal so they identify you are Arab and you can't come into the South. And that's for Christians, for so-called animists, and the British missionaries will convert them. But they create these fixed identities that could have had another legacy. And so obviously that was in the 30s, 1930s. So there's a reaction by the Northerners, of course, that, firms up their identity as Arabs and Muslims. The discourse of race is a discourse that could be used to discuss the whole of North Africa, and so the Horn of Africa, by the way, because in Ethiopia you have the same question where Amharic Ethiopians, many of them will say we're not African. The same way in which some Sudanese will say we're Arab, we're not African. So that's why thinking of Ethiopia and thinking along with Sudan as two mirror images is very useful. And that whole Horn of Africa, this must be seen as the context for an analysis. Because there are historic conflicts and historic animosities, but also parallels, where the Amhara have a long Christian history. I mean, a Christian history that's long before Europe becomes Christian. The king Ezana converts in 333, and they trace their ancestry back to even earlier. So the religious genealogy. So we can go on about Ethiopia as the other side of the Sudanese experience, which should be a useful comparison, where questions of race, color, physiognomy, all of these kinds of things matter. What is the other? There's a question here.
Okay, so there's three more questions here.
Yeah.
So the one is about U.S. sanctions. I mean, has that been imposed on the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan? What is its impact?
Yeah.
So
look,
let's just
Sudan
take those,
has suffered from U.S. sanctions for a long time. They have been through a lot of sanctions, and people make a way around it. So the Muslim Brothers, they never operated as the Muslim Brothers. They operated under other terms and other names. So, one doesn't know. So the key figure there was, of course, Hassan Torabi and his National Islamic Front, the NIF, which reconstituted itself as the National Congress Party. So they keep reconstituting themselves, and they've had lots of internal disagreements from the early 2000s that when they broke, and there are those critics of Torabi that broke away and in fact left the country or from outside. So it's a really messy internecine conflict amongst the so-called Islamists, who must take some of the responsibility for some of the mess, because they had insisted on certain ideological positions that led to the breakup of the country in the first place. That would be my argument about them. And that their influence and their weight now is hugely overestimated. So this thing about banning the Muslim Brothers, it's basically coming out of the UAE. And they asking the British to ban the Muslim Brothers. And they have said no UAE student on government funding can go to British universities because the British don't want to ban the Muslim Brothers. It's basically the UAE trying to show where their allegiance is with Israel and so on, America. And as I suppose a reaction to the Qatar, which had Qardawi, which was, and so on. So other question, the diaspora.
Yes.
That's a good one because you know, in the 2000s, one of my colleagues told me there were more doctors in Scandinavian countries, more specialist doctors in Scandinavian countries than in the Sudan. I don't know how true that is, but it was just a notion of the huge brain drain. The whole judiciary, or much of the judiciary of Qatar, are Sudanese. They are PhD students of mine when I'd worked, all teaching in Saudi Arabia. The whole of the Gulf, you'll find the Sudanese. The Sudanese are trusted. They are hardworking. They are seen as people as employable, eminently employable, because they speak Arabic, and they speak Arabic very well, and they are focused. So at one stage, I had a project on the judiciary because of Turabi. I was trying to figure out, and I had a very good relationship with the Attorney General before before Turabi came onto the scene, and was trying to work with the bar and so on. And so many of these people and their families were in Qatar and in the Gulf states, running the judiciary there. So the universities, preeminently, which was Khartoum University, or which started off actually as called Gordon College, it was one of the first institutions the British established, had one of the best medical schools, for instance, comparable to Cairo and Cape Town often. And so yes, it's a huge loss. It is a huge loss. I was able to stay abreast on Sudanese matters when I was in Oxford, because there were so many Sudanese in Oxford, and I met so many of the opposition leaders who came through, and they would call me up to come and have tea with one or other gentleman or senior person from the opposition parties. So a lot of them are still in the old metropole, as it were, and but far from the scene of the action. You know, it's not like they're sitting in Ethiopia. In the old days, the diaspora from the south would be in Nairobi and in Kenya, and still, if you wanted to meet the Southerners or the sympathizers of the Southerners, Nairobi was the place to be, and probably also Uganda. Remember that John Garang, the leader of the Southerners, had died in a helicopter crash when he came from Uganda. So that's just a little side note. Okay, gold. Besides
gold and resources,
gold, there are other resources. Yes, that's a very good one. That is a good one. So I did mention gold. In the 19th century, they had these Austrian miners, and they had interesting Austrians there, right on the borderland with Ethiopia. But they had skills, because there was mining, and they're still mining in Austria, in the highlands, in the mountains, and they do salt and other things. But you know, it wasn't found. But the main resource for that the Sudan was known for was oil, but that came to a standstill with the North-South War. But the Canadian and American companies, especially Canadians, had put in a huge amount of resources in before drilling, but in geological exploration studies, and most of that oil, unfortunately for the Northerners, was in the South. And with independence, they lost a lot of that access to that oil. But the benefit from it was that the South was landlocked, so the oil had to go through the North, and so they would get a tax. They would tax that oil going through. So it was firstly oil, and a lot of the analyses focused on the question of resources and the question of oil. Now it's shifted to gold, and Sudan is now, I think, the third largest producer of gold on the continent, which is not insubstantial. So it's huge, and the biggest hoarder of gold, amongst the biggest one or two or three, is the UAE. which some say explains the UAE support of the RSF. Lots of acronyms there.
Yeah. Okay, so there's just one more there, and then maybe we should try and wrap up. Do you foresee a resolution to this conflict in the short term, or an eventual split between the two sides of the Sudan, between, say, the Darfurian side and Khartoum?
Very interesting question. In the light of secessionism, we need to be alert to secessionism. Yes, look, the RSF, they're not Darfurians. You know, the Darfurians want Darfur if they could get it, but the RSF are so-called Arabs from the northern, those northern elite families. That's probably their origins, and they have some local foot soldiers and local generals, but the main body are not from the four region. I can't really be, I'm not very optimistic in the short term or in the medium term for what should happen. The golden period, you know, Sudan until, well, Sudan, 2 years after independence, the military took over. And it had more periods of military rule than civilian rule throughout its post-independence history. This is the history of the country. I wrote an article in the Daily Maverick in 2019 after the overthrow of Bashir, and you can refer to that article. But it has a very long militaristic history, so that's the one. So civilian rule, civil society has a place. In fact, the word intifada is not used, as far as I know, amongst the Palestinians first, but amongst the Sudanese. When they overthrow Numeiri in 1985, they call it an intifada. And we know intifada from Palestine from 1987, just a little footnote on that. So there, and the overthrow of Bashir in 2019, sort of belated Arab Spring uprising. Civilian, you have this sort of civil society initiatives, but ultimately they get mowed down and the military steps in all the time. This is the pattern. By the way, around the diaspora, the biggest Sudanese diaspora, at least the northerners, but also southerners, have always been in Cairo. At least 2 million, if not more. Cairo has been the center. You can meet everybody in Cairo, all the Sudanese. But so in terms of a civil society, it's a civil society amongst those in the diaspora. And we all know what a terrible situation there is for civil society in Egypt. So I don't know what this diaspora is. If you can have a sort of diaspora civil society in Egypt. So I'm not optimistic in this light of the historical trajectory of the role of the military. Now, the golden period was actually under a military ruler, under Numeiri, because he had fostered a peace agreement between 72. He started in 72, and this lasted up till 85. But at some point in that, of course, in 83, somebody tells him in a dream, you must adopt Sharia. You must adopt Sharia, which was just Sharia penal law. But for the most part, from 82 to 83, from 72 to 83, under Numeiri, it was actually, in terms of North-South peace and flourishing of activities for at the universities and coming in of investment, it was actually the most flourishing. So we have to deal with the military. That's what the question is. And they're not going to go back to the barracks soon.
Okay, I see there's a question by Faisal. What can we as civil society in South Africa, what role can we play? What should our stance be? And maybe, I mean, is our government playing any role at all in behind the scenes in terms of the peace process or assisting in the peace process?
Yeah. Look, the government played a role in an accord, the Pretoria Accord, between in the case of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was going on a downward spiral between the government of Abiy Ahmed and the Tigrayans, which was from within the Ethiopian state and from within the military that rebelled. And it was really, it's still a kind of perilous situation, but they did sign an agreement here. As I said, South Africa was involved very much in the south. I don't know if there's an appetite and we had peacekeepers there, and if there's interest or capacity to get these two sides to talk. But as I said, there is the Quad, which is Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the US, and I don't know, one other country. But we do have some Sudanese students here. We do have, I mean, they're not as numerous as, say, the Somalis. Is this a small diasporic Sudanese community here? I don't know if they're from the Darfur or not. But yeah, we could ask questions of the government to see what they're doing. And if they're supplying arms, that would be a good question to ask. Are we supplying arms in that direction?
Jazakallah khair, Prof.
Thank you.
Jazakallah very much for joining us this evening. I would really like to thank you more and more again for an illuminating and deeply contextualized discussion. I think we all bear witness that this has been an important reminder for the value of historical analysis in understanding contemporary crisis, particularly one as complex as the devastating as that unfolding in Sudan. I would also like to thank all of you for joining us this evening and for your thoughtful engagement. And especially, I also realize that we have some international listeners with us here. I have Dr. Chibololo from Morogoro University in Tanzania, Dr. Ali from Kenya, and we have Ahmad Jamal from Egypt. They joined us this evening here, and we're really pleased for your joining us. On behalf of CIRA, Jazakallah khair once again, and we hope to see you in the future. We have more events communicate to you the dates, when, what time, and what the topic will be. And I hope, Prof, you're not leaving us like this. We expect you to come back again with a more,
Inshallah.
You know, you have topics, you know, you haven't spoken to us about Timbuktu, and it's part of what we really want to hear from you in the near future. So I hope you and the likes of you, inshallah, will be coming on air. And, you know, we discussed this on Africa, and we need to map Africa, especially on the Islam in Africa. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good night. Subhanakallahumma bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim.
Shukran jazilan.
Innal insana
Thank you so
lafi
much.
khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihat wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.